Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this special belated edition of The Journey Show. So good to see all of you today. Sorry that we're so late. We had some technical difficulties and we are operating from the alternative studio. Luckily, we have several of them. This one is patched into Syncom 3, which, as you know, was shut down recently, but that's okay. They brought it back up just for the Journey Show. There's going to be a special Fandom edition. We have Katie Hefner, who is an expert in fandom, particularly the status of women therein. We have Chris vyas-myall, which I hope say your name so I don't mess it up.
Chris vyas-myall.
There you go. Chris is our British correspondent, one of our British correspondent, and they're amazing. And we have Erica Frank, goddess of the obscure and queen of the filth. So we're gonna get right in to fandom, but first, this news. Fighting has intensified between the South Asian states of India and Pakistan over the border state of Kashmir. The United Nations Security Council resolved unanimously on September 4th that the conflict must cease. However, early reports suggest that the Indian Army is planning an imminent invasion of the Pakistani state of Punjab, which will only escalate the conflict into a full-fledged war. Another hemisphere and another peaceful resolution. After a last popular demonstration for General Imbert, who led the recent coup in the Dominican Republic, the junta leader was replaced per a bipartisan treaty between military leaders and the constitutionalist supporters of former president. U.S. forces deployed to the island nation in late April have already begun coming home. Things may also be cooling down in the Middle East, as Egyptian President Gamal Nasser and Saudi Arabian King Faisal agreed to withdraw their support of opposing sides. Conflicts were resolved in the United States as well, as two major strikes, one against shipping companies and the other against steel conglomerates, were settled with assistance from President Johnson. A happy Labor Day indeed. Speaking of which, the nation's first skateboarding park opened this Labor Day weekend in Tucson, Arizona. Teens have been sidewalk surfing in the complex since the evening of September 2nd. Space surfers Golfer and Pete Conrad returned to Earth late last month after an unprecedented 8-day trip in Gemini 5. Their mission proved that human space is possible for the length of time required for a lunar mission. Just a few hundred miles at the Gemini astronauts' recovery site, Tropical Storm Betsy was forming. Now a full-fledged hurricane, it is currently just east of the Bahamas and threatens to hit the southeastern coast of the United States over the next few days. Its progress is being tracked by no fewer than 4 Tyros weather satellites, which will hopefully minimize casualties and property damage. Finally, science fiction author E.E. Smith, popularly known as Doc Smith, passed away from a heart attack on August 31st at the age of 75. Smith was one of space opera's earliest and brightest lights, producing the Lensman and Skylark of Space series and continuing to write throughout this year. And that's the news. All right, so as I mentioned before, this is a special fandom episode of The Journey Show. So first, I'd like everyone to introduce themselves. And if my satellite should go out of reach and I disconnect, that's okay. My esteemed panel is more than capable enough of handling things on their own, and they are far better looking than the traveler. All right, so let's start. Let's start with Katie Hefner. Tell us who you are and why you're here.
Hey, so my name is Katie Hefner. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Kent in the Department of History. I'm studying the history of science with Dr. Charlotte Slay, and specifically I'm looking at women within fandom and how they engaged with science and some of like the totally groovy things that they did. So yeah, so that's my deal. I'm really into pre-fandom or pre-media fandom. So that's kind of my spot.
Chris.
Hey, I'm Chris. Excuse me. My pronouns are they, them. I am an advertising exec from Bedford in the UK, and I am involved in fandom, and also particularly recently wrote a report on the most recent 1965 Worldcon on Galactic Journey. So I'm on board particularly to talk about British fandom.
I'm Erica Frank. My pronouns are she, her, and I am involved in sci-fi and fantasy fandom. And as you can see, some of the other lifestyles that are happening now in the 60s, where people are looking into changes in science and changes in medicine and changes in styles of music, and bringing together a more holistic view of how to face the world in the future.
I can dig it. So, Chris, I'm really interested in learning more about your research with LonCon, because that's where it was LonCon 2. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I did a little bit of research beforehand. Once again, like media fandom is not really my forte, but I'd love to hear more about like, just about LonCon 2. What was LonCon 2 in 1965? Because it's right after we're approaching that time frame where we're just right after LonCon 2.
Yeah, so LongCon was so by British standards, it was a very big fandom event, a big convention. I know by American standards, apparently that it wasn't, but compared to British standards, where often the conventions are the back room of a pub with about 20 people in them, it was quite a large-scale event, and also kind of an interesting meeting place between a lot of the different groups of fandom that are currently going on in the UK, as well as encountering the American fandom. So there was, whilst it was a polite event, there was a lot of clashes and mixing of different types of people and different cultures going on. Particularly, for example, there was a panel which had both John W. Campbell and Michael Moorcock on it, and from what I've heard, Michael Moorcock was pretty hungover at that time, and there was let's just say there was some heated debate between them over the nature of fandom and science fiction.
Yeah, John Campbell is a jerk. Sorry.
That's such a
I don't
polite
think
way
she's
to put
stating
it.
a controversial opinion here.
Yeah. So like on the panel, I was reading the transcript of the panel, and oh boy, there were some things that were, a little bit on the racist colonialist side.
Really, John Campbell. We understand, folks. We come here not to praise John Campbell, but to bury him. I actually want to move away for a moment from LongCon. I definitely want to discuss LongCon, which is obviously the biggest news, and talk about the Hugo winners this year, by the way, because we've talked at length about the Hugo nominees, and you're probably on pins and needles to know, and if you have the copy of Rat-a-Tat, you may not. The first thing I want to say is, so audience is from a number of different places and perhaps even different times. And so you may not be aware of what fandom like in 1965. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a primer on that, on what we do, how we associate with each other, and how we get together. So fans are necessarily limited by geographic area in 1965. Plane travel is expensive. We have trains, but that takes a long time. Calling outside of our local area can be an expensive proposition, as much as $1 a minute, and $1 is a lot of money in 1965. So we are largely knit together through these. These are fanzines produced by FAPA, the fan publishing organizations, and they will produce every 2 weeks or a month some kind of fanzine, often with stories, poetry, gossip, convention reports. And if you're anyone who's anyone, then you'll get some of these every single week or two, and that's how you keep up on things. Now, interestingly enough, the biggest organization close to me is one called the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, or LOSFIS. It's currently run by Diane Peltz. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is how women are really, in many ways, the backbone of fandom, despite the fact that they're showing up less in published science fiction right now. However, I'm not in Los Angeles. I'm in San Diego, where I run a small organization called the San Diego Fan Organization, or the SDFO. And we'll get together in what's called a science fiction house, or more colloquially, a slan shack. And that's a place designed for people to get together. They usually have back issues of all the magazines and the fanzines and such like. So, and every so often we get what's called a convention. And cons are, as they described, small affairs, maybe a few dozen at best.
We lost you.
And recently we celebrated the most heralded fandom, which is from fandom status. So, who was a big fan of the scene for a long time, made it in a big way, pushing the cold a couple of years, and produced all sorts of science fiction stories. And so he just had a party in his honor put on by LOSFIS. And as someone who's just made the transition to pro, it's a very exciting and much celebrated thing. All right, I see my satellite is going out of configuration, so I want to pass it on now to Katie, then Chris, then Erica. Tell us your favorite things about being a fan and what you do in 1965 to express being a fan.
What I do, let's make sure, okay, there we go. My mic is on, awesome. What I do in 1965, fanzines are critical. So obviously being involved like within a fan club, I'm currently located in Canterbury. So we have, we are the in-between point between some of the London science fiction groups that were meeting like in the 50s, like not too long ago. I believe we used to meet at the, what is it, the White, oh gosh, the White Lion, the White Hart. It was White Hart, there we go. Thank you, I was so close. We also have the Medway Science Fiction Library, which I'm super psyched to be able to go there and check out some of the materials. Yeah, it was like a short-lived science fiction library that we had. So yeah, it's basically about creating fanzines, writing letters, also assisting in conventions, which a lot of folks don't necessarily think is like honorable fan labor outside of fan communities. It's like, oh, well, you counted TAF ballots. This stuff is like really important. So that's basically what I'm doing in 1965 as a fan. And cranking the Mimeo.
Can you explain what TAF is?
The Transatlantic Fan Fund. This is a it's a it's not a fan organization, but it's a fan endeavor where folks compile money, and to my understanding, you can vote a TAF person or person for TAF to send someone from the United States to England because the World Cons are either in the States or in the UK. So, yeah.
Very good. Chris, what you do as a fan and what your favorite parts are. Have you been to an Easter con?
Yes, I have been to one Easter con. I'm kind of in a bit of a funny position geographically in the UK because they don't really have too much locally in Bedford. We have a small group which we either meet in the local library or the pub, but it's only half a dozen of us. And so but we're on the main train route, so either we tend to travel up to Peterborough, which is where a number of the Easter cons have been run, and also, or we go down to London, where I commute into, and that's also where there's actually quite a large number of fan groups. As mentioned, there's also a lot, as well as fansies, there is also a lot of stuff done just with writing letters to other fans that you know. In particular, it's kind of notable that you write into a fanzine, you often will put your name and address, and sometimes you'll just get direct responses from someone, usually polite, not always, but usually. Those other ones go in the bin. But I suppose one of my favourite parts is when you do get to meet up with people in person that you've only been corresponding with via letters, or in particular, the big events like LondonCon was a chance to actually meet up with people around the country that otherwise that we've only corresponded to on paper. And so actually getting to see them in person and finding other people that share your interest is probably the best part.
The line between us is not very wide. We see Wilson Tucker at conventions, Robert Silverberg. We talked about Larry Niven. If you're unlucky, you see Marion Zimmer Bradley and her husband Walter Green. We will talk all about that in just a moment. But first, Erica.
Hi. I haven't been to many conventions recently, but a couple months ago, Bruce Pells published his Filk Manual, which is one of the few West Coast Filk books. And it's got a few dozen different songs in it, including songs about Tolkien.
What is a Filk, Erica? Let's start at basics.
Sorry. Filk music is the music of science fiction fandom. And some of it is to the tune of classic folk songs, and some of it is original tunes. I'm fond of the ones that are to classic folk songs because many of the ones to original tunes are published just with chords. And unless you actually know the tune, you can't figure it out unless you have been there to a Filk sing. And there's a lot more activity and publications on the East Coast. So it's nice to see a new one on the West Coast. So there's a song about Lord of the Rings to the tune of the Ballad of Jesse James. And there's a charming song I intend to hand off to the young traveler called The Traveling Trufen, about a young woman whose father is a fan and she has been raised in fandom, and she abandons all of his old fanish ways to go on a road trip with a pack of Trufen, and ignores all the zines and going to conventions, and says she'll just hang outside the banquet hall and sleep on hotel floors instead of paying for her convention membership. Yeah.
And of course, oh, go ahead.
Sounds like a truly, like a very sad, oh my gosh, I feel sorry for that then. Is there a fan.
Oh, no, it's a
Sort of
very
like
joyful song. She is abandoning her parents and going off to live the wild life on her own. It's to the tune of the classic folk song "Raggle Taggle Gypsies."
Oh, okay. Amazing, amazing.
Enough with your old school, mimeos and such. I'm just going to publish one shots with the fans I meet instead of anything on a schedule.
That's another thing you should know. Fanzines right now are produced. We're talking distribution in the dozens. Galactic Journey is a fanzine, and as we're producing it, obviously you're able to get it on all of your teletype and fax machines, which is just tremendous technology. But back in the day, we would be using mimeographs. If we were lucky, we'd be using offset printing like the professionals. And there'd be very few people on our distribution list, and we would know everyone very well. Often people wouldn't pay for the fanzines. They would instead contribute in kind with articles or just being good people.
And definitely a labor of love. So I would have you run across my favorite folk singer, Lee Hoffman, who did I think she did like Gardy Lou and like other forms of like folk fanzines, but it's a little bit before like our time in 1965. So
I don't think so.
I would love to talk to you about like the some of the folk fanzines that she did. It was quite outstanding.
Yeah. I've just gotten this one, and it's nicely got references in it to some of the older ones, the zines it draws from. Publishing.
By the way, Jean-Paul Garnier asked the cost of attending conventions. At the moment, it is $2 to attend to have Worldcon membership, $3 to attend. I wonder what that'll be in, say, 55 years, if it will keep with inflation, or if it perhaps will go up much higher than that.
That seems like a very, yeah. Who knows what the future would hold? It would be preposterous if it were like $300, $400, $500. Even if you were to just pay that amount to watch it on something like a television, that would seem really weird.
I know there are some conventions where they have hooked up closed circuit television so people can enjoy certain events from the comfort of their own hotel room. Especially if they've repaired to that hotel room for extracurricular activities, which I understand Randall Garrett is particularly famous for.
And he has written filk about it.
Of course he is. And here's my question, and this may be, seems to me right now composed about 8 and 20% women, with a lot of women in important. I know you were talking about how LungCon, the chairman, is a woman, and of course the head of LOSFIS right now, Diane Peltz, is a woman. So even though it's only about 5% publishing in the magazines, women are very important in fandom. Can we name some of the big names in fandom who are women right now?
I really appreciate Ethel Lindsay's work, who I believe was the secretary of LongCon too. Her work has been really amazing, especially because she lived in Scotland for a little bit. She had some dealings with Marion Turner, and I really appreciate some of like the more femme fandom that she is into. Like, I believe like one of the fanzines that she's published recently has been Scottish She. Scottish, I've never actually heard that word like pronounced like in IRL. So
in what?
Sorry. I had this like weird time slip moment. Yeah.
So, was it you?
I think my time slipping is also messing with the connection of this. Can you repeat that? I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Let's move on.
Okay.
I'd also like to call out Beryl Henley, who does a lot of work in British fandom. She's also so she like contributes to loads of fanzines. In particular, is probably best known for her work in Zenith, where with Archie Mercer, she does these great book reviews called Double Booking, where literally the two of them will just have a conversation. And it's just typed up as a conversation rather than a very bland review. And also, she started up the fanzine Link, which like I think something like about 75% of the people that work on it are women, and it specifically looks at a lot of the women's views in fandom. And I find that her writing is really fascinating. She's kind of controversial because she tends to. At least I think this is true of a lot of the women in fandom, is that you don't tend to get sort of very timid women there. You tend to sort of be those that are willing to speak their mind. And so she's very happy to be very abrasive, and to tell people when she's not happy with what they're doing. And so she's pretty controversial in fandom, but I think she's probably one of the most interesting voices going on right now.
Some of the females in, some of the femmes in fandom that have the women in fandom, that's like the term that they want to be called, femmes.
Femfen, yeah.
Yeah. Have also, that were part of LongCon recently, did some amazing work. Like there's this fanzine called Yandro. And I believe it was Juanita Colson who won a Hugo for her. And I believe that she has like a history of filk. I'm curious to know if there are a lot of like women and femfen in filk that you can tell us about. That I'd be super interested in hearing about.
Karen Anderson, Paul Anderson's wife, has written several filk songs and been involved in editing and publishing several of the filk zines.
She's also, of course, a professional writer who has appeared in fantasy and science fiction several times.
And is also a great cosplayer as well. She does a lot of
what?
A costume player.
I see. Yes, she attends the masquerades quite frequently.
Yes.
And she, like Diane Peltz, are stunningly beautiful and creative.
I really like that this past masquerade too had allowed like children to be part of the masquerade ball. Yeah, which I think is like kind of interesting. Like in the past, from going to fan conventions, we've seen like Miss Science Fiction, which has been something that folks and fans have really had arguments about because of like the way that she dressed and her skimpy clothes and what have you. And now in 1965, with LongCon 2, British women that are basically like owning the convention, doing the most greatest things ever. And they offer a children's like judging panel for the masquerade, which is like super groovy. That's it. I just had to have my fangirl moment.
Now, I promised in the introduction for this that we'd also be talking about fan civil wars. And one thing fandom is extremely known for is its internal animosity. You would think that a bunch of kooks could get along and form a common front, but in fact, I know there's a book on
they do in packs of 30. Like 5.
And it's this thick, and just this history of the fandom and the splitting off of the fandom. Right now, there's a couple of civil wars. One of them is the eternal schism between West Coast and East Coast fandom. And every fanzine I read, someone is lambasting Ted White And for the life of me, being stuck out here in the vestibule of San Diego Fandom, I don't know what Ted White did, but he must have done something terrible. Some baby must have been devoured because so many inches have been devoted to it. Although someone said, I'm very glad Ted White was a big enough man to apologize, and for that I respect him. I don't know what he's apologizing for, but anyway. But of course, the biggest schism and the one that rocked fandom last year was, of course, the scandal of the Breen doggle. And those of you who don't know, Walter Breen is a famous numismatist, someone who collects coins. He's written books on the field. He also is an obnoxious person who likes to touch little boys. And over the past several years, he's been booted from several conventions. And finally, the committee of the last Worldcon, PacificCon, said, you may not come to this convention. And fandom was split in half between the people who said, absolutely, we do not want this person near our children or near us, and others who said, you know what, fans are all weird people with beanie propellers, and don't we have a big enough tent to allow anybody in regardless of their fetishes?
Yeah, I think the argument was, how many little children are there at Worldcon anyway? And they'll all be with their parents, and they'll be totally safe, right? And there's
right.
no
That's how
problem.
we should,
Yeah.
right. We should allow serial murderers in our midst because, hey, as long as we all got armor and guns at our sides, we'll be okay. John Boardman of New York was one of the people who led the charge for Walter Breen. I'm going to give them all the benefit of the doubt and say that the folks in New York fandom are not viscerally connected with what's going on in West Coast fandom. And so while their motives may be noble, their actions are a bit misguided. Now, there's been fallout because not only is Walter Breen persona non grata, but early last year, he and fan-turned-pro author Marion Zimmer Bradley got married. And she has defended him too. And so she didn't come to the Worldcon last year. And it has actually been editorial policy for the Journey to no longer review her works as a result of her current affiliation with Walter Breen. I don't think I'm being too controversial with that. And this is a stance that most LA fandom seems to have adopted well. Are there any other schisms in fandom with which you are aware, current or past, that you'd like to discuss? Panel.
The biggest one going on in the UK is probably between the old school fans and the neo fans. So particularly that in recent times, there's been a lot of new fans coming into the fandom. Both interestingly, both the focus is of what they like is all over the place. So some are super old-fashioned, like people like Terry Jeeves, who think that everything needs to be more like Campbell was doing at the start of when he was first starting Astounding, to those who are more affiliated with Charles Platt, who think that we need to be as literary and out there as possible. But the neo fans tend to want to shake things up a lot and change the way a lot of fandom works, whilst the old fans think that they need to sort of wait their time and there's a reason why we do things like that. So there's a lot of heated discussion between the different groups whenever they end up meeting up at conventions in the UK.
Chris, I want to follow up that. How much of this new versus old fan is tied in with new wave versus classic science fiction?
I'd say there is an alignment, but it's not 100%. So definitely the neo fans tend to be more new wavy and the old fans tend to be more traditional, but there are also some traditional fans who still are very much part of the new wave movement, and there are some neo fans who are also very old fashioned. So
and to explain, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
I was going to say, to explain to folks who don't know the term new wave, science fiction has recently had a sea change, no pun intended, largely led in Britain, where science fiction is becoming more philosophical, softer, deeper, more human focused, less technical problems. And it's called the new wave. And some of its avatars are J.G. Ballard, Brian Aldiss, Harry Harrison, although he's an American, but he's essentially an expat living in England. So that's why I asked that of Chris, because they're at ground zero. Erica, what would you like to add? I'm sure you know all sorts of gossip.
Um, there's, of course, songs about the old versus new wave fandoms. Um, I haven't kept up much with the actual drama at the conventions. I have noticed that there's conflicts between science fiction fandom and other communities that are exploring similar themes of what will the future be like, how can we make a better society to get there. I read a lot of Timothy Leary's work and keep up with his psychedelic review, which involves all sorts of new experimental medications, like the still currently legal lysergic acid diethylamide, more commonly known by its street name LSD. And he's also looking into peyote and other hallucinogens and how those affect our mind. And you would think that science fiction would be interested in the medical changes. And there's some stories that go into that, but it seems like there's pushback against anything that changes people's personalities. We don't want to change how we are. We want the world to be better, just without anybody having to do anything differently or think differently.
So I guess the most important question we have for you, Erica,
is going to be silent. Gideon, I think we lost you there.
Oh dear, how about now?
Maybe better?
All right, so I was going to say the question we have for you, Erica, is are you holding and how much?
Well, of course I'm not holding anything illegal, and if I were, I would not be saying so on a broadcast show.
That's true. Although, you know, I suspect that the racier we make this, the more we will transform television into something other than a vast wasteland. Did you know, by the way, that the SS Minnow in Gilligan's Island is named after Nelson Minnow, the former FCC chief?
I did not know that.
I didn't either. So real quick, I'd love to go over the Hugo results because they're somewhat surprising and in some ways will also tell us a little bit about the fandom. So, of course, the winner of the best novel was Fritz Leiber's The Wanderer, which was unanimously considered the worst of the Hugo slate this year. Do you know how this happened?
I don't know directly how it happened, but one thing I have been aware of is that Fritz Leiber was doing a lot of promotion in the British fanzines, and he was like literally like suggesting sending review copies before they were available in the UK to British fanzines for review. And so he was doing a lot of heavy promotion, much more than you'd see, for example, from Cordwainer Smith, who's Planet Fire is only just getting reviews now after Worldcon. So I think that's the reason. The other reason is probably also just Fritz Leiber's obviously extremely well known compared with some of the others. So I imagine there's also probably some fan bias there. And also, curiously, the reviews of it, a lot of them didn't seem to say that it was actually a good story. Most of them seemed to say that they were really impressed with how much it referenced other parts of fandom. So it seemed like a lot of people were interested in the fact that it was a science fiction novel that was extremely fan-centric rather than a great science fiction novel itself.
I see Carrie Doherty and I are of one mind. Katie, did you ever get a chance to read the Hugo slate this year?
So the Hugo slate, yep, I did see who won best novel and short fiction and what have you. Because I'm like a fanzine gal, I am super into Yandro winning with Robert Coulson. Right,
and that was not a surprise, by the way. Yandro has been up for the Hugo for 8 years now, so it was really inevitable. And I'm hoping, by the way, that that's a trend that continues. Any fanzine that is up for the Hugo many years running really should win one of these days. I will not name names, but just remember that best fanzine is spelled G-A-L-A. Anyway, I would submit that the best novel for this year was John Brunner's The Whole Man. But it sounds to me like Fritz Leiber successfully did what Harlan Ellison tried to do with dramatic presentation and failed. So dramatic presentation this year was between Dr. Lowe and Dr. Strangelove. And I think it's no surprise that Dr. Strangelove won, although The Young Traveler was, of course, a little disappointed that her beloved Tony Randall did not win for his 8 portrayals. So instead, Peter Sellers won for his 3. So I suppose that's fair. How do you feel about between the two?
Yeah, I mean, like it was sort of like a duh. Of course, we're gonna vote for like the most like grooviest one. I think like the yeah, so I think like where things get a little bit like uncool, man, is I'm really trying the 60s vibe. Like, yeah, I'm really working on that persona right now. I think
you're very Maynard G. Krebs. You're just fine. So go on. What were you gonna say?
I think where things get a little bit iffy is with the slicks, and looking at like science fiction and science fact by my buddy. He's really not my buddy. Campbell, who wins it again, and he's been guest of honor so many times in the past. It's just, yeah, that was like that's something that I'm gonna contest because it's totally uncool, man.
The fact that Analog won Best Magazine, is that what you were protesting? Sounds like it. Well, it's not a surprise, though. Analog has double the subscription of every other magazine. And speaking of neo fan versus old fan, Analog is the dinosaur. Chris, what would you should have won Best Magazine?
Well, of these, I would say that it should easily have been Galaxy. I felt that was definitely had the most interesting content and some of the best stories last year. I would say that I was a bit disappointed to see there were neither of the British magazines on the nominations this year, because Science Fantasy and New Worlds have really picked up with their new management. But I do know that sometimes there has been trouble getting them. I've heard from US fans there was trouble getting them over there. And also, it seems like that IF seems to be going through a bit of a fan revival right now, and people seem to be really into that. Again, I'm not sure why, but I guess that some people like the very old-fashioned science fiction magazines. So
it was so bad this month. You haven't seen David Levinson's review, but I of course have edited it and set up the type for our fanzine. And oh my.
It sounds so bad that it would just literally stop time.
Yes, but despite his esteemed career and nature, boy, was his last novel, just finished serialization, and If, a stinker. If doesn't seem to be doing that great. So I think one thing we can all agree on, however, is the best artist was John Schoenherr, and he probably is best known right now for doing the art for Frank Herbert's awful serial Dune. And as bad as the book is, I mean, it's not horrible, but it's truly mediocre. But the art for it, with the sandworms and all the different characters, John Schoenherr is just so good at his job. Does anyone disagree or want to put forward a different artist who they like?
I can't disagree with that. Even though I have an intense dislike of the contents of Analog, it by far and away has some of the best covers and the best art in the industry. I mean, even does. I think like S1SF doesn't even really do their own covers anymore. Most of the time, a lot of them they're just stock ones that they've bought up from years ago. Whilst every month the front of Analog just looks like in a completely different field.
I want to bring something up, and then I'd love to talk to Erica about art too. Right now, still the main way people get their science fiction is in magazines that come out once a month. That is changing. In the early 50s, magazines were everywhere. There were 40 magazines coming out every month in the early 50s, and then they started to die, and by the late 50s, it was down to 6. Now we're up to about 9 or 10, depending on how you define a magazine. And paperback books, like those put out by Ace or the winner of last year, Ballantine, are starting to pick up the slack. And it's also where we're seeing most of the women producing science fiction is in paperbacks as opposed to magazines. But magazines still very traditionally are still at the vanguard of science fiction. So it's interesting what Chris talked about. Fantasy and science fiction has amazing covers, but most of them are completely unrelated to any stories inside. For instance, the last year's covers all came from Mel Hunter pictures that he commissioned for the New York World's Fair. Beautiful pictures, excellent covers, nothing to do with what's inside. So in terms of matching the cover art to what's inside, Analog has been tops over everybody else once John Campbell stopped putting his amateur photography on the covers. Erica, do you have any thoughts on art?
I love the new trend in surrealist art and would like to see more of that in science fiction covers. We're seeing some amazing works with colors, especially that show up under a black light, that look like they're glowing, and lots of different colors and hard to read text where the letters are art forms in themselves.
That sounds like something you'd see more in the fanzines than the prozines right now.
Some, but a lot of it's being done in color, and the fanzines can't reproduce that in Mimeo, and it's harder to, and they lose some of the definition in line art. Where you're seeing it is concert posters, and starting to see it on album covers.
Kerry Doherty talks about the Australian fanzine Woomera, which I have not had the pleasure of reading. I imagine it's exorbitantly expensive to send post from Australia to here, or slow anyway. She also mentions that she really likes C.C. Finley. Finley's interesting. He's an artist. He's in a lot of stuff. I see him mostly in, I think it's a Fantastic these days. And his stuff is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it also seems like he's doing the same thing that he's been doing for the last 20 years. It seems a little stuck in his rut. Speaking of which, by the way, Fantastic and Amazing have undergone a tremendous change recently. Sel Goldsmith, now Sel Lally, left the helm, and now Amazing and Fantastic appear to be mostly reprints. Which is sad. Again, we're seeing the decline of magazines as the forefront of fiction. Something really interesting that's happening, we're seeing a lot of books come out and then get serialized later in the British science fiction magazines. So I have to wonder if in 10 years, magazines are going to be a science fiction afterthought. How do you feel about that as fans? Do you feel like magazines are more personal, more of a fan forum, and to lose them would be losing a vital portion of our community? I'll start with Erica.
I like the variety in magazines, and I think if we switch to science fiction mostly being published in books, you're going to see a lot more novels, even very short ones, where there's no connection between them, and anthologies that are less likely to be multiple authors, because a publisher is going to have to look at what's going to sell. And 8 authors nobody's heard of aren't going to sell as well as 8 stories by one author who may have won an award. And I would like to keep the variety in magazines. And I can see where if they don't hit a certain level of subscriptions and sales every month, it's hard to keep them going. And with more science fiction coming out in television and movies, it may be harder to get fans to agree to pay for science fiction in print.
Well, us snobs will always go for the literary. Chris, you are in an interesting position because you review new writings in SF, which is basically a quarterly magazine in all but format. So how do you feel on this issue?
Yeah, New Writings is an interesting kind of experiment that's kind of going on from John Connell. And it seems like it seems to, I don't see the back end figures, but it seems like it has pretty good sales. It must do, because it's been starting to get paperback reprints as well as continuing for over a year. So it's clearly something that's getting picked up by the general public and being generally liked. What I would say the difference I feel is that when you go into a certain magazine, you kind of get a feeling that you're going to know what the content is going to be inside. So when I kind of like, if I pick up Analog, I expect it to be the sort of slightly harder, but the more scientific-based fiction and the kind of stuff that we know that Campbell loves. And then if I pick up FNSF, I expect it to be maybe slightly more on the literary side, slightly more fantasy in there. Whilst I kind of do know what Connell might like, it's still sort of like it's much more varied, and you don't get sort of like a real sense of continuity in it. So it's much more potluck, and it's the same with publishers as well of novels. Like maybe I know that Ace is likely to produce adventure stories coming out, but I don't 100% know. No, for example, the stuff that Delaney does is very different from the stuff that Gardner Fox does. So you're kind of having to sort of just go off the blurb. So I feel like if magazines die, you lose almost a consistency of knowing what you might get month in, month out, and the type of science fiction or fantasy that would be right for you.
And by the way, Chris mentioned John Carnell. He used to be the publisher of New Worlds, correct?
New World, science fantasy, and science fiction adventures. He basically used to, once Nebula went down in Britain, he was basically the only person publishing science fiction magazines for a while. But now they've all been split off between different publishers.
Lex, you can be from whatever time you want. We are stuck in 1965, but we know we have visitors from every era. And in fact, Vicky Lucas went back to the time of Moliere, which you can see if you go to Galactic Journey right now and see the latest article. Katie, do you have a thought on magazines versus books? Is that something you've been able to dig into?
So different purposes, different objects, different purposes. I think that the Playboy publications with the science fiction short stories that they're adding in are really something interesting, and maybe science fiction writing can sort of get into yeah, like just looking like about future predictions, thinking about some of like the really groovy ways that science fiction can operate within like this more sexual liberation Playboy kind of field, maybe, I don't know, with countercultures and Tolkien and Silk. That's just that's one avenue. Another projection, I guess, with magazines is looking at the correlations between criticisms between fanzines, magazines, digests, all of this, and how perhaps maybe in the future it would change and become more a form of like academic criticisms, where like fan groups could potentially become like, I don't know, science fiction associations, where there's more SirCon stuff going on. So, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there is a fanzine that has 2 issues out right now, and it's somewhat professionally bound, called SF Horizons, and it's out of England, and it has both fans and professional authors, and it's an attempt at doing a more literary analysis of the genre. And I have to wonder if those kinds of endeavors are going to become more common as time goes on.
It would be really cool if like a fanzine, like, I don't know, I'm just pulling a name out of the Hugo list, like a fanzine, like perhaps like Double Bill was able to send out a questionnaire to writers in the science fiction community and ask them a series of questions to get like their intake on stuff. That might be a fun thing that could potentially happen in the future.
The opportunities are limitless. All right, we are coming close to the end of our show today. You will notice on your telefax screen we have provided an invitation for you all to join us for live conversation at Portal 55, where we can continue this discussion. And because there will not be so much interference on the satellites, you won't have to worry about my face breaking up. Although I suspect it's my face that's actually causing the breakup. And I want you all to know that our next show is not going to be in 2 weeks. It's going to be in 3 weeks, and it's going to be on movies. And a featured guest is going to be Natalie Devitt. Movies are her specialty. You may have seen her panel at Worldcon this year, where she talked about the movies of the last 15 years. We'll be doing that again, but this time in a journey context. There may also be other people on the panel. We haven't quite decided yet. It's basically whoever really knows about movies of the last 15 years and wants to be in on it. So are there any parting thoughts on fandom? Are there any fans that you think are out there that are people to watch? Someone mentioned Charles Pratt, who I understand is up and coming in the English fandom universe.
He is, but he kind of has a bit of the Harlan Ellison problem, that he knows how to wind everyone else up the wrong way. So whilst everyone says, oh, he's a really talented writer, he puts out some great fanzines, he's also very snide in a lot of what he says and speaks his mind at every meeting. So there's kind of a joke that the one constant in British fandom is that everyone hates Charles Pratt.
So I'm just gonna jump in and say, from an Americanist standpoint, I'm really looking forward to the Masquerade next year in 1966. I just think that Karen Pohl Anderson is someone to look forward to. Juanita Colson, Bijo Tremble. These are some women that I think maybe might have like an influence on some of like the cultural heritage practices of fandom in the future. And they may end up saving a lot of things that we love. And yeah, that's my bid for who to look out for.
And to tag on to that, we now know where Worldcon is going to be held next year, which was a mystery for a while. There were people holding out for Syracuse, but now it looks like it's going to be in Cleveland, which should make Marie Vibert, who is a fan and sometimes associated with the Journey, very happy, because the home of the Browns will be hosting TriCon next year. So I hope we can all fly out to Cleveland for the Worldcon. Erica, any parting thoughts on upcoming fans or phenomenon fandom that you want to comment on?
I think a lot of sci-fi fandom needs to relax, be groovy, listen to some good music, smoke something possibly legal, and just mellow out a bit.
And I want to say something to look forward to. I understand that the Gene Roddenberry anthology show called Star Trek may be coming out as early as January 1966. And unlike any show to date, with the possible exception of Twilight Zone and Outer Limits to some degree, it will be true science fiction written by real science fiction authors, and maybe the breakout hit of next year. I understand it stars William Shatner, who is no stranger to science fiction, having been on 2 Twilight Zone episodes and an Outer Limits episode. I have trouble believing that he'll be a good captain of his ship. Right now he plays the assistant district attorney for a show called For the People, and he's so we'll see if his chops are white enough to handle being captain of a ship. All right, folks, we are going to end this show for now, but thank you all for coming. Thank you for dealing with our technical difficulties. And next time we promise to have them all ironed out.
or I'm going to just have to go into that same 6 feet under with Doc Smith. So hope to see you all in Portal 55, and thanks for coming.